Welcome to this session on assessment of the macrostructure and the microstructure of written narratives. It's something that I think should be done for struggling students. Certainly, it provides you with a wealth of knowledge about where and how to target your intervention when you're working with young students who struggle with sentence level construction as well as overall macrostructure construction of the narrative. So we will be talking about those two aspects of the narrative. First of all, the macrostructure, the ingredients of the narrative at a general level, and secondly, a micro level. And what we're referring to there is the language devices. And those language devices are not just spread ad hoc across the narrative hill. Some are much more important and salient at different points along the narrative hill than others. So we'll be looking out for those. I'm going to share my screen with you now and pop myself up into the corner out of harm's way. So let's dive in to assessment. And it is a lengthy process. So again, I will reiterate, and I certainly haven't done it with all tier one teaching situations. So when I'm in a large class, I do get all the students to do a cold task, and I might read through all the samples, but only select those that are problematic to really analyse at a deep, close level. And then if I'm doing the pre, then I'll obviously need to do the post as well. And the samples that I'm going to refer to throughout this session were taken from a year 4 tier 1 presentation that I did across the term last year with very interesting results. So we're going to look at macrostructure, which again I'll reiterate is the overall structure or ingredients of the narrative. So we start with the orientation, the introduction, where you set things up like characters and places and times, move then with steps into the problem, and then there's a response to that problem, and then push out into the events that lead up to the solution. And that's a really critical set of events, because within that you can have a couple of failed attempts where the character attempts to solve the problem but doesn't do so. And in doing that, you create interest and suspense. And then the problem finally gets solved and there's a response to that. And then the moving out into the neutral, the settling out phase, where there is maybe a consequence for the problem or a sort of a moral to the story, but it certainly gets wrapped up in the end. So that's what we're referring to in terms of the macro structure, and that's discussed in the very first session, in the very first webinar that I've recorded. So you're going to see two texts in a minute, and they are both from the same subject, year 4 girl, who was reported as being an average writer by her teacher. She and the whole class were given 3 minutes planning and 30 minutes writing. So the first prompt back in April 2021 was write a story about the night a girl or boy got locked inside Target. And the second prompt, 8 weeks after the first and after a whole pile of teaching had taken place, was write a story about the day a lion escaped from the zoo. So you'll see that the two prompts are providing the students with an opportunity to explore how a problem occurs. How does that person get locked inside target? How does that lion get out of the zoo? What do you do when you're locked inside target? What do you do when you're a lion out in the metropolitan area? And how do both of those get solved? So there's a lot of opportunity for events to occur, for emotions to come up, for danger, suspense, high risk, emergency kinds of actions and responses. They are also both the titles of stories within the 8 programs. So quite often what I will do in pre and post tasks is choose a story that I know I'm not going to teach the students that year and ask them to write on that for their pre and post. So I want you to read through the 2 texts and in your minds kind of evaluate what the difference is between them and see if you can describe to yourself what the difference is between them. The first is the pre-test or the cold task, as Pi Corbett calls it in Talk for Writing. And this was the night a girl or boy, but in this instance the subject is a girl, so she chose a girl, got locked inside target. And I chose target because students know that very well. The other option is maybe Kmart. But I didn't want a department store where there was more than just toys or, furniture or something like that in there. There was a variety of departments for the character to be able to kind of interact in. And this is her response. I'd like you to read that now. I'll just move myself. Okay. So this is the hot task, and this was done in July. The cold one was done in April, the hot task in July, and the day a lion escaped from the zoo. So have a read of this. Okay. So there's no question that this text is more creative and more interesting, more imaginative. It's got better imagery than the first. It's probably got less in terms of character development, but so much more in terms of action. So a much more sophisticated plot in this one. And so if we're going to try and work out what the difference is in terms of being able to see whether the teaching that took place was effective, let's have a look at some statistics that were drawn from the 2 samples. So she wrote more in July, and in April she got 11 on the macrostructure, and in July she got 19. And I'll talk to you about where I got those numbers from, because that's we're going to look at a rubric and map her stories against them to see exactly what she captured, what elements of the narrative hill she captured in each of her stories. To connect ideas, she used an additive, a temporal, and an adversative. Here the same, additive, temporal here, and adversative, but she also used consequential and causative connectors. An increase in adjectives. These were all pre-modifying adjectives. And even in here, there was an adjectival string of 2. The same number of cognitive verbs, but here a huge shift in dynamic verbs, and you'll see exactly why. Because that lion did a lot more than the girl in Target. So is it because the lion is a more dynamic animal, or is it because she crafted the plot so that he was going to do a lot of things after the problem? 2 adverbs of manner versus 4. So again, much more specificity around the verb. And here, look at this. 3 adverbs of place versus 14 in the second sample. However, interestingly, not the same with time. So this lion did a lot in a lot of different places, but not across a lot of different times. And so this could well be a goal for her. Simple and compound sentences mostly, compound and a few complex sentences mostly. 3 episodes of dialogue, and as I said, she kind of developed the little girl in Target more than she developed the character of the lion, and maybe again that's got something to do with the human quality. It's really fun to make these hypotheses along the way. And you'll see here a lot more devices of specificity and imagery. So a simile, as black as a beetle, and inherent in that there was alliteration, BB, black as a beetle, and adverbs of degree, really something, very something, so something. So she's now being much more specific in her postulation of the verbs, how she wants us to understand the actions of this character, of this lion. So we're going to have a look at that narrative macrostructure, and I used an existing one that was developed by the Northeast Metropolitan Language Development Centre and Outreach Service in 2016 here in Western Australia. And with their permission, I modified this I sort of spread it out, gave it a bit more specificity around the narrative hill, and added more microstructure as well. So let's see what that looks like. There are 10 sections in here. 3 are related to the setup or the introduction or the orientation. And it's really important to note that a student can only get points in this section if they have included a character, a time, and a place in the setup. If they haven't included it in the setup, but they have included it later on, it's not counted. This is salient to the setup or the orientation. Then there's the problem plus an internal response to the problem. So if you're looking at the narrative hill, as soon as there's a problem, you've got an opportunity to give that character an internal response. They either say something or feel something in response to the problem. And you'll see that happen again with the solution. And then a plan. Not many students use the plan, but when you see a plan, it will be something like he decided to look at the control panel and see if there was a way that he could escape from the aliens. So it's like at a mental level, it's not actually active, it's a planning, and so you're using the cognitive verbs to plan the action that you're going to take. Over here, the attempt. So this is after the problem and before the solution. And you'll see that's really interesting that the little girl that wrote the two samples didn't have any planning in her first sample. Beg your pardon, start again. Didn't have any attempts in her first sample, but had a multitude in her second. And this was something that I really focused on a lot in the intervention sessions, teaching the students how if you put events after the problem that lead up to the solution, you can inject interesting and suspenseful elements into your narrative. Here is the conclusion or solution, followed again by the same thing that we saw after the problem. So after the solution, where you've been saved or you've got out of target or the lion's been captured, something happens. There's an internal response, an emotive response, or there's some dialogue. And again, when you're teaching narrative, they're two good places to save the dialogue for. We know that students want to put in a lot of dialogue and sometimes it overtakes the narrative. So if we can say to them, put it in after the problem and after the solution, they're really salient spots to put dialogue in. And then the consequence is the sort of the outcome, the consequence, the wrap up, the moral of the story. So after everything's sort of done and dusted, there's one or two lines that just say it's all okay now. They're never going to go back on the Ferris wheel again, or he'll never try and hide inside target again, or that lion will never escape from the zoo. So let's have a look at the pretest that our subject did. And what I did is I divided it up according to the narrative hill to see where she used most of her energy. And what you'll see here is that she used it in the setup and the orientation. She had a lot of information in here because right here, she finishes at the problem and then there's nothing left afterwards. There's no more solution, there's no attempts, there's nothing after this. So you've got a very top heavy or front heavy narrative with a lot of energy and effort going into setting up that little girl going into J-Mart or Target or Kmart, wherever she went. And that was fine because you got kind of a nice sense of the girl and the parents and how it all happened. But then, of course, there was no time left to resolve that problem. So let's have a look at the analysis. So as you'll see here, she got a lot of points for the characters and the times, because we know she used 7 instances of adverbs of time, and lots of those, well, because she mostly wrote orientation, they're all packed in there. A few places, an indirect reference to the problem. So if we go back to her story, beg your pardon here, May hurried to find this toy, but it was too late. The workers shut the door and locked them. So that gets 1 point for an implied problem. If she'd gone on to say she was locked inside Target for the night, it would have afforded her more marks. She did say, so we go back here, she did say May was scared. So she got a feeling or thought that was explicitly provided. But thereafter, nothing. No plan, no action, no solution, no plan, no consequence. So she got a score of 11. Let's have a look at the post test. In amazing contrast, what she's done here is one sentence. Last week, time, my lion friend, character, from the zoo, place, and here's the one word of the problem, escaped. So this is in stark contrast to her previous narrative where everything was loaded at the front. Now, everything is loaded at the back or really in the middle. So this is her very elaborate section between the problem and the solution. So this lion did a lot in a lot of different places. He opened the gates, he ran, he carried something, he sat, he hopped onto a bus, he walked, he sat down, he whined, he shivered, he knew something, he rubbed his hands, he ran, and then he came. So there's a lot of activity going on in that section, and you'll see what she's done here wherever she's used that that adversative but here, and there's another but here. So in those two instances, because she used those buts, she's actually attempting to solve the problem, but there's failed attempts. And then the solution is that he knocked on the door and Mum opened it and she let him in. And then the wrap up is that he lives with her forever now. So let's have a look and see how that looks. So there are, even though she just set it up in the beginning with the lion, there are other characters in there. So there's the mum, and then there's the lady on the train. And then there's references to time, not as many as the previous one, but a lot of references to place. So she did get the setup reference to place and the setup reference to time and the setup reference to character. And there were others in the story as well. So the escaped is here, that gets her 2 points. And then there's an implied concern that it wasn't explicitly stated, but there's an implication that there's a response to the problem. No plan. Lots of actions here. And then the final action is that, yep, he's led in the house. No response, no feelings or dialogue in response to that. And then that he can live with them forever. So in this instance, she got a score of 19, and that's where that 11 and 19 have come from. So let's have a look at the narrative microstructures now. So what I've done here is tried to include all the narrative microstructures. I might just flick onto a different share, which would be this share, onto the checklist. So if you've done the webinar about language devices, you will recognize these from that. So just a very quick overview of these. What we're looking at in narratives is the nature and the sophistication of the dynamic verbs. So are they upgraded? Are there adverbs of manner that accompany them? And then reflection and planning with mental verbs via cognitive verbs, emotional verbs or sensory verbs. Orientation via adverbs of time and then adverbs of place. Proper nouns, so specificity is gained through proper nouns, so Perth Zoo, target, names of characters. Upgraded nouns, appositives, adverbs of degree and adverbs of frequency. Imagery through lots of different techniques, pre-modifying adjectives, post-modifying phrases and clauses, adjectives that are part of a subject. So when you've got something like the kitten is cute, the cute is the adjective, similes and metaphors, and idioms. Personification through the adjective or the verb, and onomatopoeia. And then all those devices for connecting ideas, using connectors for reasoning, consequence, adversity, time, condition, and addition. Emphasis, because we can't add voice to the text that we write, we have to use things like repetition or rules of threes, alliteration or rhetorical questions to get our reader to attend to specific parts of the story. And finally, cohesion. So we've got to have words that go together, that make the characters flow through the story or the places flow. We've got to have the pronouns correctly adhering to their points of reference. And if we're writing with an extended metaphor, we have to use the theme-related words. So these are the language devices that we are going to look at in the microstructure. And so just alerting you also to this handout that you can count or tick and cross or make a comment over 3 different samples of a student's writing using the language device checklist to see what's changing about the student's writing style. So back here. So now you'll see here, we've got dynamic verbs. So here, just write them in. So this is all the verbs section. Static verbs that code cognition, like I decided or he decided. Sensory verbs and emotional verbs. And here, adverbs of manner. So quickly, slowly, those sort of ly words. And here's just an idea to look at tense. So what sort of tense structure the student's using. And sentence structure. So simple, compound, complex, or complex compound sentences. Looking along here is the imagery. So are students using adjectives before the noun, happy girl, after the noun, the girl who was smiling, the girl with curly hair, or in a subject, verb, adjective, phrase, or clause. Other forms of imagery, and we've already talked about these, similes, metaphors, personification, onomatopoeia, idiom. And then for specificity, are they using proper nouns, upgraded nouns, appositives, adverbs of degree, adverbs of frequency, and first or third? It's unlikely that they'll be using second person point of view, so there won't be any second person pronouns. To orient, we use adverbs of place and time. These are the connectors. You can either write a tally in there or write the ones in. What are they using to emphasise? Are they using repetition or rule of threes, alliteration, rhetorical devices, or other? And down here, some internal speech. Are they using any internal dialogue, such as he wondered, he thought, dialogue, or direct or indirect, and in terms of lexical cohesion, how well are they maintaining that tightness of cohesion throughout the story? And then there's just other. So planning, are they used, and this is a age-old violation of punctuation that students demonstrate, which are run-on sentences, either using no full stop or a comma in the place of a full stop. Are there punctuation errors, grammatical errors, vocabulary errors, spelling errors? Is there evidence of editing? So this is just, and it's quite a lot, I know, and you might only have to do it, once or twice a year for the struggling students. But I can tell you that when you've done it, you get such a thorough and deep understanding of that student's writing, and you know where to pitch the lesson or the instruction or the intervention. So I've compared the pre-test in red with the post-test in green language devices. So let's have a look and see what she did. Again, we know that there's a very similar number of cognitive, and in fact very similar kinds of cognitive verbs, and only in the pre-test did she use sensory verbs. But have a look at the nature, not just the number, but the nature of the dynamic verbs. Look at the ones here. She's got some reasonable ones like opened, screamed, hurried and locked. Then you look at the post-test: escaped, opened, carried, scuttled, hopped, walked, whined, blew, shivered, rubbed, stood, came, knocked. So a much more sophisticated and wider spread of verbs. Again, more adverbs of manner. Interestingly, all her adverbs of manner are ly in the second sample. One incorrect, fastly. So no ly in the first, more phrase level, but here at word level. Just simple past tense in both. And this is the sentence breakdown. So you can see 2 to 8, 1 to 2 here. So these are the important ones here. Next is the adjectives. So you've got best, small, humongous, that's her best there. Now we've got iron gates, wet road, rusty metal step, empty bus, cold rain, narrow footpath, soggy footpath, narrow house, small shop. So again, she's got so much more invested in creating imagery for her reader in that post-test. Just one example each. May was scared and his legs were tired, so tired. 2 post-modifying phrases in the pre-test, 1 in the post. 1 simile. Pre-test, 2 proper nouns, none in the post. I think in terms of upgraded nouns, announcement in the first was an example of a higher level noun, and briefcase and main in the second. No appositives. Adverbs of degree, only these 4 came out of the second, and in both it was third person. Adverbs of place, so she's got preposition determiner noun, but also preposition determiner adjective noun. To my narrow house, along the soggy footpath, along the wet road, on the narrow footpath. So nice extension of the adverb of place to include adjective plus noun in there. And her adverbs of time are much more sophisticated in the first. And that's something interesting. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe just because there's this big investment in time, in place, not so much in time. In terms of connection, as I said, there's more, overall 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 connectors in the second, and 2, 4, 5, 6 in the first. But good to see that there were consequential and reasoning ones. one alliteration, black as a beetle. Dialogue in the first, not in the second. Good lexical cohesion in the first, so she called the girl and she, doors and them, gift, it, target, gift card, one. So they were all terms she used for the gift card. Shopping centre, target, humongous store, and store were 4 different ways that she used to refer to target. Lion friend, he, my lion, 3 different ways to refer to the lion. A lady and she, and the door and it. So there were no examples of poor cohesion. No planning and no editing. That should be green. No run-on sentences in the second, but yes in the first, and everything else is fairly similar across the two. So the areas that are improved across the 8 weeks were her verb usage, very much so, in terms of those attempts between the problem and the solution. More adjectives used, many more adverbs of place and adverbs of degree. So these were all taught deliberately to the whole class. And so one would like to think that that improvement in all of those is a direct result of her learning those techniques. But also, when you adjust the macrostructure, you will get a similar adjustment in the microstructure. And what do we need to target? Emotive verbs in both, because there weren't any in either. More adverbs of manner, so we can teach her how to jazz up her verbs. More complex sentences using connectors of reason and consequence. There's only one example of a simile, so we could teach more plus personification through the adjectives and verbs. More adverbs of time, connection of reason, and repetition to give some emphasis, and maybe some dialogue in that, particularly in that second sample, that would be useful. So that's why analysing the sample is so important, because it's the only way you can see what exactly is happening inside those stories. You get a sense, you get a feel for the story, but until you start counting and comparing and looking to see what the profile is inside that narrative, you don't get the finer detail that you need to set goals. One thing I'd really like you to have a look at, and I'm not going to demonstrate it here, I'm going to leave that up to you to have a look at, is Microsoft Immersive Reader. It's an analytical tool that's built into Word or OneNote or Outlook, and you can copy and paste a student's essay or story into a Word document and then use the built-in tools to identify nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives to assist with analysis. And look, the level of analysis is reasonably accurate. Sometimes adjectives might be mistaken for nouns, but, you know, that's a small price to pay for a really useful snapshot of the linguistic devices across those 4 areas employed by your student. You watch this demonstration, and all I did was put in the pre and post samples to give you an idea of the type of information you can glean when you put a text into Immersive Reader. So that's the link, and watch until 11 minutes 40 seconds. So have a look at the pre-test. You'll see it gives nouns, adjectives, best and small, verbs and adverbs. And they're color coded, and you can. I took the liberty of putting the first letter or the first few letters of the classification above the words. Here is the post test. Same deal. And you can just have a look and see, okay, as I was rattling off all those verbs before, again, I can just do it very easily. Escaped, open, ran. I'm just looking at lexical verbs. Carried, sat, glared, scuttled, hopped, walked, could drop, sat, whined, blew, shivered, knew, needed, find, sleep, rubbed, stood, ran, came, knocked, opened. So a plethora of verbs. It's really good for also putting in expository text, because then you can see the type of nouns that the student has used. And of course, we know that nouns are really important in expository texts and verbs in narrative. So I'm more interested in the verb choice that the student uses. So I'll just stop that share and come back to you. And just reiterate that all the handouts are available for you to accompany this session. And I really encourage you to sample your class or your small group or an individual client that you're working with, and then do a close analysis of their sample using the rubric that I've supplied for you, and see what information you glean from that, and then look at the language devices and see how they marry up with the narrative devices, and see where you can start to teach those language devices and what goals you can glean both at macro and microstructure after doing these in-depth assessments. Not for the whole class, it's too time consuming. Save it for those children that really need a good close look at their narratives in order to plan their intervention in the best way possible. So good luck with that. I hope you find enormous satisfaction from doing it. Cheers.